Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Marcus Chen had been hiking the Appalachian Trail for 6 years, completing sections every summer during his vacation time. He knew the North Carolina portion like the back of his hand, or so he thought. In August 2019, he decided to tackle a familiar 12-mile section near the Nantahala National Forest, a route he'd completed at least 4 times before. The weather was perfect, clear skies and 72 degrees, and he set out at 7 in the morning with confidence and a light pack. The first 3 hours were exactly as he remembered. He passed the distinctive boulder formation that looked like a crouching bear, crossed the wooden bridge over Silvermine Creek, and stopped for lunch at the scenic overlook where he always rested. Everything was proceeding normally. He checked his GPS watch and confirmed he was making excellent time, maintaining his usual pace of 3 miles per hour. The trail markers were all where they should be, the white blazes painted on trees guiding him forward as they always had. Around 2 in the afternoon, Marcus began to feel something was off. He couldn't quite identify it at first, just a nagging sense that something wasn't right. The trail seemed to be taking longer than usual, but he attributed it to fatigue. Then he passed a distinctive lightning-struck oak tree, split down the middle with blackened bark. He remembered passing it an hour earlier. That didn't make sense. The trail didn't loop back on itself in this section. He checked his GPS watch, but the display showed something impossible. According to the device, he'd been walking for 14 hours, and his position was marked at the exact same coordinates as his starting point. The timestamp read 9 p.m., but the sun was still high in the afternoon sky. Marcus stopped walking, his heart beginning to race. He pulled out his phone, but it showed the same impossible time and offered no signal despite being in an area where he'd always had at least 2 bars. Deciding to trust his eyes rather than his electronics, Marcus continued forward. He told himself there must be some kind of technical glitch, maybe solar flare activity or something affecting GPS satellites. But 20 minutes later, he passed the bear-shaped boulder formation again. Then the wooden bridge. Then the scenic overlook where he'd eaten lunch. His lunch trash was still there in the designated waste bag he'd left, but now there were 2 bags, then 3, then 4, as if multiple versions of himself had stopped at the same spot. The afternoon sun never moved. It remained frozen at the exact same angle, casting identical shadows that didn't shift despite Marcus walking for what his watch claimed was now 18 hours. His legs should have been exhausted, but he felt exactly the same level of energy as when he'd started. He wasn't hungry, he wasn't thirsty. He was just walking the same trail segment over and over, passing the same landmarks in the same order, finding more and more evidence of his previous passages. At the lightning-struck oak, Marcus counted 27 sets of his boot prints in the soft soil, each one perfectly preserved and identical. He screamed, and his voice echoed strangely, as if the forest was swallowing the sound and playing it back wrong. He decided to go off-trail, to break the loop by leaving the marked path entirely. He pushed through the undergrowth, fighting through mountain laurel and rhododendron, heading perpendicular to the trail at a 90-degree angle. After struggling through dense vegetation for what felt like an hour, Marcus emerged back onto the trail right at the bear-shaped boulder. He was back at the beginning of the loop. He tried the opposite direction, bushwhacking through the forest on the other side of the trail. Same result. He emerged at the boulder. He tried marking trees with his knife, carving arrows pointing away from the trail, then following those arrows into the deep woods. No matter what direction he walked, no matter how far he pushed into the wilderness, he always emerged at that boulder. The eternal afternoon began to feel oppressive. Marcus tried everything. He ran the trail backward. He crawled. He walked with his eyes closed, letting his hands guide him along the path. Nothing changed the loop, the same landmarks in the same order, the evidence of his passages accumulating. At the overlook, there were now dozens of trash bags. At the creek, the soil was churned up from hundreds of boot prints. The forest was becoming crowded with the archaeological evidence of his impossible journey. Then Marcus noticed the other hikers. They appeared one by one emerging from the tree line. Each one had the same 1,000-yard stare, the same exhausted confusion. A woman in her 50s with a Tennessee Volunteers shirt. A young couple holding hands. An elderly man with a walking stick. None of them spoke. They just walked the loop, passing the same landmarks, leaving their own accumulating evidence. When Marcus tried to speak to them, they looked through him as if he wasn't there. He checked his watch again. It claimed he'd been hiking for 6 weeks. The sun still hadn't moved. His body still felt the same. And now he understood what this place was. Not a trail, but something else. Something that collected hikers and kept them walking forever through the same beautiful afternoon. The same perfect weather. The same 12-mile section that never ended and never changed. Marcus walks the loop still. Sometimes he sees new hikers appear, looking confused and checking their GPS devices. He tries to warn them, but no sound comes out anymore. The trail has taken even his voice. The sun hangs motionless in the sky. The white blazes mark the way forward. And Marcus Chen, who knew these mountains so well, has become a permanent resident of a trail that exists outside of time, looping forever through an afternoon that will never end. Daniel Rivers was an experienced mountaineer who'd climbed peaks across North America, but he'd never attempted Mount Mitchell in North Carolina, the highest peak east of the Mississippi. In November 2017, he planned a winter ascent, timing his climb for a clear weather window. The established trail to the summit was straightforward, but Daniel chose a more challenging route up the north face, a steep scramble that required technical climbing skills, but offered solitude away from the tourist trail. The climb went perfectly for the first 5 hours. Daniel made good progress up the rocky face, using his ice axes and crampons to navigate frozen sections. He was within 1,000 feet of the summit when he first felt the sensation of being watched. It was subtle at first, just a prickling at the back of his neck. An instinctive awareness that he was the subject of attention. Daniel paused on a narrow ledge and looked around, scanning the mountainside above and below for other climbers or wildlife, but he was completely alone. The feeling intensified as he climbed higher. It became oppressive, a weight of observation that made his skin crawl and his hands shake. Daniel had felt many things during dangerous climbs: fear, exhaustion, exhilaration, but he'd never felt actively watched by the mountain itself. That's what it felt like. Not that someone was watching him, but that something was watching him, and that something was the mountain, the rock and ice and stone that surrounded him. At 800 feet from the summit, Daniel found the bodies. They were partially preserved by the cold, frozen in various climbing positions on the rock face. 3 bodies, all showing signs of having died in the middle of their ascents. No evidence of falls or avalanches. Just climbers who had stopped moving and frozen in place. Daniel checked for identification and found IDs for hikers who'd been reported missing over the past 5 years, all during winter attempts on Mount Mitchell. Daniel radioed for rescue services, reporting the bodies, but his radio crackled with interference that resolved into something that might have been words in a language he didn't recognize. The mountain was speaking to him through his radio, using electromagnetic waves to communicate something alien and wrong. He dropped the radio, and it bounced down the rock face, disappearing into a crevasse far below. The loss of communication equipment in the middle of a technical climb was potentially fatal. But Daniel was more frightened of hearing that voice again than of being stranded. He decided to continue to the summit, reasoning that the established trail down the other side would be safer than trying to descend the technical route he'd climbed. But as Daniel climbed higher, the mountain began to resist him. Handholds crumbled when he grabbed them, though the rock had been solid moments before. Ice gave way under his crampons, forcing him to make desperate moves to avoid falls. The mountain was actively trying to prevent his ascent, and Daniel understood with growing horror that it had killed those other climbers, that it killed anyone who tried to reach the summit by this route. Why? The question drove Daniel forward, even as terror urged him to retreat. Why would a mountain deliberately kill climbers? Mountains weren't conscious, weren't alive in any meaningful sense. But Mount Mitchell was different. Something about this peak, something in its geology or its history, had given it awareness and agency. It watched and it judged, and it killed those it found wanting. At 300 feet from the summit, Daniel pulled himself over a rock outcropping and came face to face with why the mountain killed. There was something at the top, something the mountain was protecting. He could see it through a gap in the rocks above, a structure that shouldn't exist, angular and black, made of material that looked like stone but reflected light in ways stone never did. The structure predated human civilization, possibly predated humanity itself. The mountain had built itself around this artifact, or had been built by it, becoming a living guardian that protected the secret at its peak. Daniel understood that he wasn't supposed to see this. No one was supposed to see this. The mountain killed to maintain its secret, to ensure that whatever the black structure was, it remained hidden from human eyes and human curiosity. Every climber who'd attempted this route and gotten close enough to see the truth had been stopped, frozen in place by some power the mountain possessed, left as warnings to others who might follow. Daniel felt the mountain's attention focus on him completely. The weight of its observation became physical, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. His limbs began to feel heavy, sluggish, as if the cold was penetrating deeper than his clothes, deeper than his skin, reaching into his bones and blood and beginning the process of freezing him from the inside out. He was becoming like the others, another preserved warning frozen on the mountain face. With the last of his strength, Daniel forced himself to move. Not up toward the summit and the secret, but sideways, traversing across the rock face toward where he knew the tourist trail ran. If he could reach the established route, maybe the mountain would release him, satisfied that he was retreating from the forbidden zone. Each movement was agonizing, fighting against the force that wanted to root him to the spot and freeze him solid. Daniel's vision began to tunnel, his extremities going numb despite his insulated gloves and boots. He was losing the fight, the mountain was winning, and he would become the fourth frozen warning on the north face. But he kept moving, pulling himself inch by inch across the rock, driven by pure, stubborn survival instinct. He couldn't feel his hands or feet anymore, couldn't tell if he was gripping properly, relying entirely on muscle memory and desperate hope. Then Daniel's hand closed on something that wasn't rock. A cable, the safety cable that ran along the tourist trail for the final steep section before the summit. He'd reached the established route. The moment he pulled himself over the edge onto the maintained trail, the pressure released. The crushing weight of observation lifted, the creeping cold retreated from his core, and Daniel collapsed onto the wooden stairs that led up the tourist path, gasping and shaking. Other hikers found him there. Confused tourists who'd taken the easy route up and were surprised to find a technical climber lying on the stairs. They helped Daniel to the summit, where the observation tower and paved parking lot seemed absurdly normal after what he'd experienced. There was no sign of the black structure from this angle, no evidence of the mountain's secret. It was hidden, protected, visible only from the deadly north face route that the mountain guarded with frozen corpses. Daniel reported the bodies to park rangers, giving coordinates for where they could be found. Recovery teams were sent up, but they found nothing. No bodies, no evidence anyone had died on that rock face, no trace of the 3 missing climbers Daniel had seen. The mountain had hidden its warnings, or Daniel had hallucinated them, or they existed in some state between real and unreal that defied normal recovery efforts. Daniel never climbed again. He sold all his equipment and moved to the Midwest, far from any significant mountains. He obsessively researches Mount Mitchell and other high peaks in Appalachia, looking for patterns in climbing accidents and disappearances. He's found hints that other summits might have similar secrets, protected by similar guardians. The mountains are ancient, and they keep secrets, and they watch anyone who gets too close to discovering what they hide. Daniel knows he should forget what he saw, but he can't. Somewhere near the summit of Mount Mitchell is proof that humans aren't the first intelligent beings to inhabit Earth, and the mountains themselves are actively working to keep that truth hidden. Robert Patterson had been photographing abandoned structures throughout Appalachia for his master's thesis, documenting the slow reclamation of human spaces by nature. In March 2020, just before the pandemic lockdowns began, he was hiking through a remote section of the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee, following rumors of an old homestead deep in the backcountry. A local historian had mentioned it in passing, an 1800s cabin that had been abandoned during the Civil War and forgotten by everyone except a few elderly residents who remembered childhood stories. Robert hiked 6 miles off the nearest Forest Service road, following a creek bed and using a combination of old topographic maps and GPS coordinates the historian had provided. The coordinates led him to a hollow between 2 ridges, a place so remote and difficult to access that he understood why no one had bothered to visit in decades. The forest here was old growth, massive hemlocks and oaks that had never been logged, creating a canopy so thick that little sunlight reached the ground. The cabin stood in a small clearing, and Robert's first thought was that it was too well preserved. After more than 150 years, it should have been a pile of collapsed logs, but instead it looked like someone had abandoned it last month. The wood was weathered but intact, the roof was solid, and glass still filled the window frames. Even more bizarre, there was smoke rising from the stone chimney, a thin gray stream that climbed straight up into the still air. Robert approached cautiously, calling out to announce his presence in case someone was squatting in the structure. No response. He circled the cabin, noting details that didn't make sense. The glass in the windows was old, the wavy, hand-blown type from the 19th century. The door hung on hand-forged iron hinges that had rusted but not failed. But the smoke was fresh, and through the windows he could see a fire burning in the hearth, flames dancing over logs that were clearly not a century old. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior was furnished as it might have been in the 1860s. A rope bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, shelves holding clay jars and tin plates, a cast iron pot hanging over the fire. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, but not the thick accumulation of decades. It looked like someone had been living here recently and had simply stepped out for the afternoon. On the table sat a half-eaten meal, cornbread and beans on a tin plate, still soft and fresh. Robert began photographing everything, documenting this impossible preservation with growing excitement and confusion. This could be the find of a lifetime if he could figure out the explanation. Maybe the local historical society had restored it without telling anyone. Maybe it was maintained by some eccentric landowner. But those explanations didn't account for the fresh food or the fire that burned without anyone tending it. As he photographed the interior, Robert noticed a journal on a shelf beside the bed. The leather cover was worn, and the pages were yellow with age, filled with handwritten entries in fading ink. The most recent entry was dated March 15, 1863, exactly 157 years before Robert's visit. It was written by someone named Ezekiel Marsh, describing life in the cabin and the hardships of mountain living during wartime. Robert carefully photographed each page, his hands trembling with the significance of the find. Then he reached the final entry, and his excitement turned to cold dread. The last words Ezekiel Marsh had written read, "Something has come to the hollow. I saw it, moving between the trees at dusk, tall and wrong. It calls to me in voices of the dead. I am alone here, and I fear I will not live to see spring. If anyone finds this journal, know that the cabin holds me still. I cannot leave. When I try to walk beyond the clearing, I find myself returned to the door. This place has become my prison. And I do not know if I am still among the living or have passed into something else. Beware the hollow, it does not let go." Robert backed away from the journal, his heart pounding. He turned toward the door and found it closed, though he'd left it open. When he tried the latch, it wouldn't move. The windows showed the clearing outside, but when he put his hand against the glass, it was warm, almost hot, and his reflection looked wrong. There was someone standing behind him in the reflection, a tall figure in 19th century clothes, gaunt and hollow-eyed. When Robert spun around, the cabin was empty except for him. He tried everything to open the door. He threw chairs against it, kicked it, slammed his body into the wood. Nothing worked. The door might as well have been solid stone. The windows wouldn't break no matter what he threw at them. As panic set in, Robert noticed changes in the cabin. The dust was getting thicker. His backpack, which he'd set by the door, was fading, becoming translucent. When he looked at his hands, they seemed less solid, as if he was gradually becoming part of the cabin's impossible preservation. Time behaved strangely. Robert's phone showed hours passing, then days, but the light outside never changed. It remained perpetual afternoon, with the sun fixed at the same angle. He ate the food from the table when hunger became unbearable, and it tasted fresh, and the plate refilled the next time he looked at it. He slept in the rope bed and woke to find more entries appearing in the journal, written in his own handwriting, though he had no memory of writing them. After what his phone claimed was 2 weeks, though it felt like both hours and years, the door opened on its own. Robert ran outside and found himself on a park trail 6 miles from the nearest road, with no idea how he'd gotten there. When rescue services found him, he was severely dehydrated and suffering from exposure, claiming he'd been lost in the woods for only a few hours. His phone was dead, and his camera held no photographs. Every image he'd taken in the cabin was gone, replaced by corrupt data. Robert dropped out of his graduate program and refuses to hike in the mountains anymore. He's tried to find the hollow again, leading Forest Service personnel and other researchers to the coordinates, but there's nothing there except old-growth forest, with no clearing and no cabin. The historian who told him about the location has no memory of their conversation and no record of any homestead in that area. Sometimes Robert wakes at night, convinced he's still in the cabin, that everything since has been a dream the hollow created to keep him docile. He looks at his hands and wonders if they're becoming translucent, if he's slowly fading back to where he really is, trapped in a cabin that exists outside of time, preserved forever like everything else the hollow holds. Amanda Torres had thru-hiked the Appalachian Trail twice, covering all 2,190 miles from Georgia to Maine each time, and she'd thought she'd experienced everything the trail could offer. In April 2018, she was section hiking a portion of the trail through southwestern Virginia, a relatively easy stretch she'd chosen for a quick 4-day solo trip to clear her mind after a difficult breakup. She'd done this exact section 3 years earlier during her first through hike, and remembered it as peaceful and uneventful. The trouble started on her second night, when she set up camp near a ridgeline that offered spectacular views of the valley below. The shelter at this location had been full of other hikers during her first visit, but this time she was completely alone, which she attributed to being early in the season. Amanda pitched her tent on a flat spot about 50 yards from the ridge edge. cooked dinner, and settled in to watch the sunset paint the valley in orange and purple light. As darkness fell, she heard the first scream. It came from somewhere down the slope below the ridge, a human voice crying out in what sounded like absolute agony and terror. The scream went on for an impossible length of time, at least 30 seconds of continuous sound that no human lungs should be able to produce. Amanda grabbed her flashlight and ran to the ridge edge, shining her light down the steep slope, but saw nothing except trees and darkness. She called out, asking if someone needed help, but there was no response except silence. 10 minutes later, another scream, then another. They came at irregular intervals, sometimes from below the ridge, sometimes from the sides, occasionally seeming to come from above, though there was nothing but open sky. Each scream was different, but similarly inhuman in its duration and intensity. Amanda recognized what she thought were different voices, men and women, young and old, all screaming in various tones of fear and pain. She pulled out her phone to call for rescue services, but there was no signal, despite being on an exposed ridge where she should have had coverage. She retreated to her tent, zipping herself inside and putting in her earbuds, playing music loud enough to drown out the screaming. But the sound penetrated anyway, as if it wasn't really coming through the air, but originating inside her head. The screams began to form patterns, coordinating with each other, creating harmonies of horror that seemed deliberately composed. Amanda realized with growing terror that whatever was making these sounds was intelligent and was performing for her benefit. Around midnight, the screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by voices calling her name. "Amanda," they whispered from the darkness, using inflections and tones from different people she'd known throughout her life. Her mother's voice, her ex-boyfriend's voice, her deceased grandmother's voice. The voices called to her sweetly, asking her to come out, to come to the ridge edge, to look down into the valley and see the beautiful thing waiting for her there. Amanda buried herself in her sleeping bag, covering her head and trying to block out the voices, but they grew louder and more insistent. They knew things about her, intimate details from her childhood, secrets she'd never told anyone, memories she'd forgotten. The voices wove these personal details into their calls, creating a tapestry of her entire life spoken by phantom mouths in the darkness. "Remember when you were 7 and you found the dead bird in your backyard?" her grandmother's voice asked. "Remember how you cried and gave it a funeral? Come to the ridge, Amanda. Come see all the dead things. They're so beautiful here." She lasted until dawn, curled in a fetal position, trembling and crying. When the first light appeared in the sky, the voices stopped instantly, as if someone had flipped a switch. Amanda emerged from her tent to find her campsite altered. Someone or something had arranged her gear in a perfect circle around the tent while she'd been inside. Her boots had been placed at the edge of the ridge, toes pointing down toward the valley. And everywhere around the clearing, carved into trees and scratched into rocks, was her name, repeated hundreds of times in various sizes and styles. She packed up with shaking hands and started hiking, desperate to put distance between herself and the ridge. But after 2 hours of hard hiking what should have been 4 miles down the trail, Amanda found herself back at the same campsite. The circle of gear was still there, though she'd packed it all. The boots were at the ridge edge again. Her name covered every surface. She tried again, hiking in the opposite direction. Same result. The trail, which had seemed so familiar and safe, was now a loop that always returned her to the screaming ridge. On the second night, the screaming started earlier, before sunset. The voices returned, but now they were angry, accusatory. They blamed her for things she'd done and things she hadn't done, cataloguing her failures and flaws in exquisite detail. Then they began to threaten. They described what would happen if she kept trying to leave, painting scenarios of horror so vivid that Amanda collapsed to her knees, hands over her ears, screaming herself to drown them out. That's when she saw them. Figures emerging from the tree line, dozens of them, hiking toward her with jerky, unnatural movements. They were hikers, or had been once. Now they were something else, their faces locked in eternal screams, their mouths stretched impossibly wide, their eyes reflecting the dying light with an animal gleam. They were all ages, wearing hiking clothes from different decades, and they converged on Amanda with clear purpose. She ran to the ridge edge, having nowhere else to go. The figures surrounded her, their movements synchronized. Then, as one, they stopped screaming and simply pointed down into the valley. Against every instinct, Amanda looked. In the growing darkness below, she saw lights, thousands of them arranged in patterns that hurt her eyes to follow. The patterns formed words in a language she shouldn't understand, but somehow did. The message was simple. You belong here now. Everyone on the ridge belongs forever. Welcome to the chorus. Amanda jumped, not to fall, but to climb down, to escape the ridge by descending the steep slope that no hiker was supposed to attempt in darkness. She slid and tumbled through the undergrowth, breaking branches, tearing clothes and skin, not caring about the damage. She fell for what seemed like miles, far farther than the ridge was tall, through a darkness that became absolute. When she finally stopped falling, she was lying on a Forest Service road, 5 miles from where the trail crossed it, with no memory of how she'd gotten there. A passing motorist found her at dawn, bruised and bleeding, babbling about the screaming in the chorus. Rangers searched the ridge but found no evidence of any other hikers, no campsite, no names carved into trees, nothing unusual at all. Amanda's gear was never recovered. The section of trail through that area has since been closed due to geological instability, though no official explanation for the closure has been provided. Amanda hasn't hiked since. She's moved to Arizona, as far from the Appalachian Mountains as she could get, and she lives in a high-rise apartment in Phoenix where she can't hear anything that sounds like screaming. But sometimes, late at night when the city is quiet, she hears her name whispered in voices she recognizes, and she wonders if she really escaped the ridge or if she's still there, just another voice in the eternal chorus. Kevin Bradshaw was an outdoor photographer specializing in landscape and wildlife imagery, with work published in major magazines and featured in galleries. In September 2019, he ventured into the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, searching for a specific location he'd seen in a century-old photograph. The image, taken in 1919, showed a stunning waterfall, with distinctive rock formations, but the exact location had been lost to time. Kevin had spent months researching historical records and comparing topographic maps to narrow down the site. He finally located what he believed was the right area, accessible only by an unmarked trail that split off from a maintained path. The unofficial trail was barely visible, overgrown with brambles and mountain laurel, but Kevin pushed through with his heavy photography equipment. Motivated by the possibility of capturing modern images of a location that hadn't been photographed in a century. After 2 hours of difficult hiking, he found the waterfall, and it was perfect, exactly matching the 1919 photograph. Kevin set up his camera and tripod, taking shots from various angles as the afternoon light filtered through the forest canopy. He was reviewing images on his camera's screen when he noticed something odd. In several photos, there appeared to be people standing near the waterfall, though the location had been empty when he'd shot the images. He looked up from the camera. No one was there, but in every photograph, the figures appeared, translucent and faint, dressed in clothes from different eras. Intrigued rather than frightened, Kevin took more photos, deliberately aiming at the spots where the figures appeared in previous shots. The images became clearer with each photo. The figures were hikers, dozens of them from different time periods spanning from what looked like the 1800s to modern day. They stood in clusters, all facing the waterfall, motionless and silent. Kevin's journalistic instincts took over. This was unprecedented, potentially evidence of some kind of mass paranormal phenomenon. He began documenting everything systematically. Then he noticed the pattern. Every figure visible in his photographs was also visible in the original 1919 image. Once he looked carefully. They'd been there all along, faint shadows he'd assumed were artifacts of old photographic processes or damage to the print. But now he understood. These weren't ghosts in the traditional sense. They were people who were here, had been here, would be here. The waterfall was showing him something about time itself. Kevin set up his camera for a long exposure shot, planning to capture the waterfall's motion while keeping the figures visible. As the 30-second exposure ran, he watched through the viewfinder, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The figures were moving, but not through space. They were moving through time. He could see them arriving, setting up camps, eating meals, sleeping, then packing up and leaving, all compressed into 30 seconds. Days or weeks of activity flickering past in moments. When the exposure finished, Kevin reviewed the image and saw himself in it. Not his current self, but multiple versions of himself at different ages. There he was as he appeared now, 43 years old with graying hair. But also there was a younger version, maybe in his 20s, wearing clothes he didn't recognize, and an older version, perhaps in his 60s, using a walking stick. All three versions of himself stood at the waterfall, taking photographs, occupying the same space but different times. The implications crashed into Kevin's mind with overwhelming force. This place existed outside normal time, or maybe time existed differently here, with past, present, and future visible simultaneously. Everyone who had ever come to this waterfall, or ever would come, was here now, layered over each other, separated by years or decades, but occupying the same physical location. The waterfall wasn't haunted, it was showing the truth of time that human perception usually filtered out. Kevin began photographing frantically, documenting this impossible phenomenon, filling memory card after memory card. The figures in his photos became more solid, more real, until he could make out their faces and read the expressions. They all looked confused, many looked frightened, and a few looked aware, as if they understood what was happening and had accepted it. Those aware ones were looking directly at the camera, directly at him, across spans of decades. Then Kevin saw something that made him stop shooting. In a photo showing his older self, the 60-something version wearing a walking stick, he could see what that future self was photographing. The older Kevin was taking pictures of a younger Kevin, the 43-year-old version currently standing there. The future self was documenting the past self, creating a loop of observation across time. And in the background of that future photograph, visible on the camera's screen, he could see another figure, even older, perhaps in their 80s, also taking photographs. The recursive nature of it overwhelmed Kevin's mind. How many times had he come here? How many times would he come here? Were all these visits happening simultaneously, separated by the illusion of linear time? Was he trapped in a loop of returning to this waterfall, compelled to document it over and over, each visit visible to all the other visits? The waterfall seemed to laugh at him, its eternal cascade unmoved by his existential crisis. Kevin tried to leave. He packed his equipment and started back down the unmarked trail, but the trail didn't lead out. Instead, it curved back to the waterfall, though he'd been walking in a straight line away from it. He tried again, marking trees with his knife to track his path. The marked trees led in a circle, impossible given the terrain, but undeniable. Every path led back to the waterfall, just as every moment of time at this location led back to itself. Night fell, and Kevin made camp, terrified but unable to leave. In the darkness, he could hear the other versions of himself moving through the campsite, muttering to themselves, checking equipment, some crying, some laughing. He couldn't see them without the camera, but they were there, living out their own visits to this place that existed outside time's normal flow. He tried to sleep but couldn't, haunted by the sound of his own voice speaking words he hadn't said yet or had said years ago. At dawn, Kevin found himself on the marked trail, 2 miles from where he'd split off to find the waterfall. His equipment was intact, his memory cards full of impossible photographs. He hiked out in a daze and drove straight to a colleague's house, another photographer he trusted. They reviewed the images together, and his colleague confirmed he could see the figures, see the multiple Kevins, see the evidence of Time's strange behavior at the waterfall. But when Kevin tried to return a week later, he couldn't find the location. The unmarked trail was gone, or had never existed, or wouldn't exist until some other point in time. The coordinates on his GPS showed only dense forest, with no trail and no waterfall. Other hikers and locals, he asked, had never heard of a waterfall in that area. Kevin's photographs remain the only evidence it exists at all. He continues to search for it, obsessively, during every visit to North Carolina. His hair has more gray now, approaching the age of that second version he saw in his photographs. He knows he'll find it again because he's already seen the proof that his older self makes it back. But he doesn't know if that's comforting or terrifying. The waterfall is waiting, existing in all times at once, and Kevin Bradshaw is destined to return to it, to take more photographs, to document the place where time reveals its true recursive nature, where every moment contains all moments, where past and future are just different angles of the same eternal present. Jennifer Moss and her 10-year-old daughter, Emma, had been planning their camping trip for months, a mother-daughter bonding experience in the Pisgah National Forest. Jennifer had reserved a spot at a popular campground, confirming the reservation twice and printing out detailed directions. In July 2021, they arrived at what seemed to be the right location, a well-maintained campground with designated sites, fire rings, and picnic tables. Site number 17 matched their reservation confirmation. They set up their tent and spent a pleasant afternoon exploring the nearby creek and identifying wildflowers. Emma collected interesting rocks, while Jennifer prepared dinner on their camp stove. Other campers occupied several nearby sites, and Jennifer exchanged friendly waves with a family at Site 15 and a couple at Site 19. Everything seemed normal and safe. Exactly what she'd hoped for. As evening approached, Jennifer noticed something odd. The other campers were setting up elaborate meals, pulling out chairs and lanterns and coolers, but there was no sound, no conversation, no laughter, no music from radios, nothing. The families moved through their camping routines in complete silence, as if they were mimes performing for an invisible audience. When Jennifer called out a greeting to the family at Site 15, they didn't respond or even acknowledge her presence. Emma noticed it too. "Mom, why is everyone so quiet?" she asked, her voice seeming unnaturally loud in the silence. Jennifer didn't have a good answer. She suggested that maybe it was a church group that had taken a vow of silence, though even as she said it, she knew it didn't make sense. The other campers included children Emma's age, and no child could remain that silent for so long. After dinner, as darkness fell, the other campers began to fade. Not all at once, but gradually, becoming translucent like watercolors in the rain. Jennifer and Emma watched in horror as the family at Site 15 simply dissolved into transparency, their forms becoming ghost-like, then disappearing entirely. Their camping equipment remained, but the people were gone. The same thing happened to the couple at Site 19 and to all the other campers they'd seen earlier. Jennifer grabbed Emma and ran for their car, desperate to leave immediately. But the car wasn't where they'd parked it. In fact, the road they'd driven in on was gone. Where there had been a paved campground loop, there was now only forest. The site number posts remained. The fire rings and picnic tables were still there, but all the modern infrastructure, the bathrooms and water spigots and trash receptacles, had vanished. The campground looked like it hadn't been maintained in decades. They returned to their tent, Jennifer trying to remain calm for Emma's sake while her mind raced through impossible explanations. She pulled out her phone to call for help, but it showed no signal, and the date was wrong. According to the phone, it was July 19th, 1976. Jennifer knew that was impossible, but when she tried to change the date, it wouldn't respond to her touches. The phone's camera still worked, though, and she began documenting what was happening. As full darkness arrived, the other campers returned, but they were different. They were still silent, still moving through camping routines. But now they looked old-fashioned, wearing clothes from decades past. Jennifer recognized styles from the 1970s, then 1960s, then earlier. The campers cycled through different eras, appearing for a few minutes, then fading out, only to be replaced by campers from a different time period. The campground was showing her its history, playing back all the people who had ever stayed at Site 15 and Site 19 and all the other sites. Emma clung to her mother, crying quietly, asking when they could go home. Jennifer held her daughter and wondered the same thing. They were trapped in some kind of temporal loop, experiencing the campground not as it existed in 2021, but as it had existed across many decades, all compressed into a single night. She watched a family from what looked like the 1950s cook dinner at Site 15, followed by hippies from the 1970s, then yuppies from the 1980s, each group unaware of the others, each one fading after a brief appearance. Then Jennifer saw something that made her scream. At Site 17, where their own tent was pitched, she saw herself and Emma. But it wasn't their current selves. It was them from years ago. Emma, perhaps 5 years old, Jennifer younger and happier. This other version of them was going through camping motions, setting up a tent, cooking dinner, settling in for the night. Jennifer had no memory of this earlier visit, but the evidence was undeniable. They'd been here before. She watched the younger version of herself put young Emma to bed in the tent, then sit by the fire alone, staring into the flames with a sad expression. Jennifer remembered that time in her life, right after the divorce, when everything had been difficult and confusing. Had they really come here then? Had she suppressed the memory because something terrible had happened? The younger Jennifer in the vision looked frightened, kept glancing around the campsite as if sensing something wrong. The vision fast-forwarded. Jennifer watched her younger self suddenly grab young Emma and run for the car in the middle of the night, just as she'd tried to do earlier. The younger version found the car missing, the road gone, just as they had. The loop had happened before. They'd been trapped in this place before, and Jennifer had somehow forgotten, blocked it out, pushed it deep into her subconscious where it couldn't hurt her. But now they were back, and the campground recognized them. As Jennifer processed this realization, more versions of herself and Emma appeared. Site 17 showed them at different ages, different visits, all trapped in the same loop. Emma as a toddler, as a baby, as a teenager, as an adult. Versions of themselves from the past and the future, all overlapping, all trapped in this place that existed outside normal time. The campground was collecting them, Jennifer understood. Every time they came here, or every time they would come here, the place held on to those moments, replaying them endlessly. They weren't in the present, or the past, or the future. They were in all of them simultaneously, and the campground was feeding on the temporal energy of their repeated visits, growing stronger with each loop. Jennifer made a decision. She woke Emma, packed their tent and gear, and walked into the forest. Not toward where the road should be, but directly away from the campground, into the dark woods with no trail. If the campground wanted them to repeat the loop, to run for the car and find it missing, then she would break the pattern. They would leave in a different direction, doing something none of the other versions had done. They walked all night through dense undergrowth, Emma crying, Jennifer pushing forward with desperate determination. Strange sounds followed them, the whisper of phantom campers, the echo of their own voices from other timelines. But Jennifer refused to stop or turn back. At dawn, they emerged on a highway, miles from the campground, with no memory of how they'd gotten there, and no physical evidence they'd walked the distance. The campground reservation company had no record of Jennifer ever booking Site 17. The confirmation email she'd printed was gone, replaced by a reservation for a completely different campground that they'd never visited. Maps of Pisgah National Forest showed no campground in the location where they'd spent the night. When Jennifer tried to find it by driving the roads, she remembered there was nothing there, just an unmarked stretch of forest with no campground access. Jennifer and Emma both have the same recurring nightmare now. They're at Site 17, and they see infinite versions of themselves at all the other sites, all trapped in an endless cycle of arriving, staying, discovering the truth, and trying to leave. In the nightmares, they understand that they never really escaped, that they're still there, and their normal life is just another vision the campground is playing for them, keeping them docile while their true selves remain trapped forever in a place that collects moments and refuses to let them go. Tyler Jefferson was a geological surveyor working on a mapping project for the U.S. Forest Service, using GPS and laser ranging equipment to create detailed topographic data surf of remote areas. In May 2020, he was assigned to survey a section of the Appalachian Mountains in eastern Kentucky, an area that had never been properly mapped with modern technology. The assignment was supposed to take 3 days, a straightforward job he'd done dozens of times before. On the first day, Tyler established his base camp and began taking measurements from various points around a mountain known locally as Blackface Ridge. The name came from the dark rock formations that gave the peak a distinctive appearance. Tyler's equipment worked perfectly, feeding data into his computer that would be compiled into a 3D model of the terrain. By late afternoon, he'd completed about 40% of the survey grid. The second day, Tyler returned to the same locations to take additional measurements for verification. That's when he noticed the problem. The measurements didn't match. According to his equipment, the mountain had moved. Not by inches or feet, but by significant distances, dozens of yards in some locations. His first assumption was equipment malfunction, but his GPS was working perfectly, showing his own position accurately, and his laser rangefinder was properly calibrated. Tyler spent hours checking and rechecking, taking measurements from fixed reference points he'd marked the previous day. The conclusion was impossible, but undeniable. Blackface Ridge had changed position overnight. The peak was now 47 yards farther north than it had been the day before. The entire mountain had shifted as if it was sitting on a conveyor belt. Tyler called his supervisor, expecting to be told there was some logical explanation, but his supervisor was skeptical and asked him to document everything thoroughly. On the third day, Tyler set up motion-triggered cameras around the mountain and prepared to stay awake all night, determined to catch the mountain in the act of moving. He established observation posts at 3 different vantage points, each equipped with sensitive instruments that would detect even minor geological shifts. As darkness fell, he settled in with coffee and determination, watching the mountain through night vision binoculars. At 2:37 a.m., Tyler's instruments went crazy. Seismographs showed movement, GPS coordinates began shifting. Laser rangefinders lost their lock as the distance to the mountain face changed in real time. Through his binoculars, Tyler watched something impossible. The mountain was walking. Not sliding, not collapsing, but walking with a slow, deliberate gait that shouldn't be possible for millions of tons of rock and soil. The entire peak swayed from side to side, lifting and setting down like a massive creature taking ponderous steps. Tyler's mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. Mountains don't move. They can't move. The fundamental laws of geology and physics don't allow for it. But the mountain was moving, and it wasn't alone. As his eyes adjusted and his brain processed the impossible sight, Tyler realized that all the peaks around him were moving. The entire landscape was in motion. Mountains walking in a slow migration across the Appalachian Range, heading north at a pace of perhaps 100 yards per hour. He grabbed his camera and began recording, capturing video of the walking mountains. The footage showed exactly what he was witnessing, leaving no room for rational explanation. The peaks moved with a rhythm that seemed almost alive, swaying and stepping in coordination with each other, like a herd of enormous animals. Trees on their slopes remained upright, adapting to the movement as if the mountain's motion was completely natural to them. As Tyler recorded, he noticed something even more disturbing. The mountains had features. Now that he was watching for it, he could see what looked like eyes, massive indentations high on the peaks that reflected starlight with an organic gleam. And the rock formations he'd thought were random geological features now appeared to be limbs, appendages folded against the mountainsides, dragging the peaks forward with each slow step. The mountains were alive. They'd always been alive. They were ancient creatures beyond human comprehension, so large and so slow-moving that human civilization had mistaken them for geological features. Tyler realized with nauseating clarity that all of Appalachia might be made up of these creatures, and humans had been building on them, mining them, treating them as inanimate resources while they slowly, patiently walked their eternal migration. Tyler's camera captured something else that made him drop the device with shaking hands. One of the mountains was looking at him. A peak about 3 miles distant had turned, reorienting itself with a motion that took 10 minutes to complete, and now those massive indentations that might be eyes were aimed directly at his position. The mountain was aware of him. It knew it was being watched and recorded, and it didn't like it. The ground beneath Tyler began to move. Not earthquake shaking, but a deliberate, purposeful rolling motion, as if the mountain he was standing on was waking up, disturbed by his presence. Tyler ran, abandoning his equipment and his base camp, running blindly through the forest in the darkness. Behind him, he heard sounds that shouldn't exist, a deep grinding rumble that might have been a mountain's voice, a bass frequency so low it vibrated his bones and made his lungs spasm. He ran for hours, until dawn broke, and he found himself on a Forest Service road with no memory of how he'd gotten there. When rescue personnel found him later that day, sunburned and dehydrated, babbling about walking mountains, they attributed his story to dehydration and sun exposure. A helicopter was sent to retrieve his equipment, but the location where he'd made base camp couldn't be found. The GPS coordinates pointed to a sheer cliff face that shouldn't exist according to existing topographic maps. Tyler's video footage was corrupted, showing only static and distorted images that could have been anything. His supervisor reviewed the data he'd collected and confirmed that the measurements showed impossible changes in the mountain's position, but attributed it to equipment malfunction rather than the alternative explanation. Tyler was reassigned to a desk job, officially due to the psychological trauma of being lost in the mountains, unofficially because no one wanted a surveyor who claimed mountains could walk. But Tyler knows what he saw. The mountains are alive, and they're moving, slowly migrating across the continent on a timescale that makes human history irrelevant. They've been walking for millions of years, and they'll continue walking long after humanity is gone. Sometimes Tyler looks at topographic maps and traces the shapes of the Appalachian Range, and now he can see the truth in the patterns. The mountains aren't a chain formed by tectonic pressure. They're a herd, a family group of impossible creatures moving together through time and space. Tyler doesn't hike anymore. He's moved to the flatlands of Nebraska, where the ground is stable and nothing moves except what should move. But he watches geological surveys from around the world, and sometimes he sees evidence in the data, tiny inconsistencies that might indicate other mountains in other ranges doing the same slow walk. He's tried to publish his findings, but no scientific journal will accept a paper claiming mountains are alive. So he keeps his knowledge to himself, a terrible secret that makes him look at every mountain with new fear. They're walking. They've always been walking. And someday they might decide to wake up completely. Christine Wu had been a trail maintenance volunteer for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy for 5 years, spending weekends clearing brush, repairing water damage, and maintaining trail markers. She knew her assigned section of trail in western North Carolina better than anyone, having walked every foot of it dozens of times. In October 2018, she was doing a routine solo maintenance run when she encountered something that shouldn't exist. About 3 miles into her section, Christine noticed a trail junction that hadn't been there the week before. A clearly marked path diverged from the main trail, heading off into the forest with fresh white blazes painted on the trees. This was impossible. No new trails were supposed to be added to this section, and even if they were, Christine would have been informed as the primary volunteer for the area. The junction appeared on no map, and the trail itself looked old, well-worn, as if it had existed for years. Christine's first thought was that someone had created an illegal spur trail, which happened occasionally when hikers wanted shortcuts or access to scenic spots. She decided to follow it to determine where it led, planning to report it and arrange for its closure. The parallel trail ran alongside the main Appalachian Trail, staying within sight of it but following its own distinct path through the forest. The white blazes were properly placed, following all the standard guidelines for trail marking. After half a mile, Christine began to feel uncomfortable. The parallel trail was too perfect, too well maintained, better than even the main trail she worked so hard to keep clear. The blazes looked fresh, as if they'd been painted that morning, but there were no signs of recent human activity, no footprints, no broken branches, no evidence anyone had walked this path recently. The trail seemed to maintain itself. Then Christine saw the hikers. A couple emerged from around a bend ahead of her, walking toward her on the parallel trail. They wore modern hiking gear and carried proper backpacks, looking like typical through hikers. Christine called out a greeting and prepared to ask them about the trail, but as they got closer, something about them seemed wrong. Their movements were slightly jerky, like video playing at the wrong frame rate, and their expressions never changed, frozen in neutral pleasantness. The couple walked past Christine without acknowledging her, even though she was standing directly in their path, and had to step aside to avoid collision. She turned to watch them continue down the trail, and they flickered like bad television reception, their forms becoming transparent for a moment before solidifying again. Christine's comfort level dropped to 0. She decided to abandon her investigation and return to the main trail immediately. But when Christine tried to leave the parallel trail and cross back to the main Appalachian Trail, which she could still see just 30 yards away through the trees, she couldn't reach it. The forest between the two trails had become strange, distorted. The 30-yard gap seemed to stretch to hundreds of yards as she walked toward it, the main trail receding like a mirage. After 10 minutes of walking perpendicular to the parallel trail, Christine gave up and returned to the path she'd been following. She had no choice but to continue forward on the parallel trail, hoping it would eventually rejoin the main trail. More hikers appeared, all with that same jerky movement and frozen expression, all walking without acknowledging her presence. Christine began to recognize some of them from photos she'd seen of missing hikers, people who'd vanished on the Appalachian Trail over the years and had never been found. They were here, on this impossible parallel trail, walking forever in some kind of loop. The trail began to diverge more dramatically from the main path, heading into areas Christine knew were impassable due to cliffs and dense vegetation. But on the parallel trail, the terrain was smooth and easy, as if the landscape had been altered to accommodate the path. Christine passed landmarks she recognized, but they were wrong, mirrored or inverted, like seeing familiar places in a dream where everything is slightly off. She walked for hours, her GPS showing impossible positions that jumped around randomly, sometimes placing her miles from where she should be, sometimes showing her in locations she'd passed hours before. The sun never moved from its afternoon position, keeping the light constant and shadowless. The parallel trail went on, and the ghost hikers continued to appear and disappear, walking their eternal loop without awareness or purpose. Christine finally admitted to herself that she was trapped. This parallel trail was some kind of dimensional pocket, a place that mimicked the Appalachian Trail but existed separate from normal reality. Everyone who found this path became part of its population of eternal walkers, doomed to hike forever without reaching any destination. She thought about the missing hikers, the ones whose disappearances had never been explained, and wondered how many of them were here, walking the parallel trail in a loop that never ended. Desperate, Christine tried everything to escape. She walked backward, hoping to reverse the path. She tried leaving her gear and running, thinking maybe the trail held onto equipment, but not people. She attempted to climb trees to get above the trail's influence, to see if there was a way out from an elevated position. Nothing worked. The parallel trail held her as surely as if she were physically chained to it. Then Christine had an idea. She was a trail maintenance volunteer, and she had her tools with her. If the parallel trail existed because of the white blazes marking it, maybe she could uncreate it by removing the blazes. She took out her scraper and began attacking the white paint marks on the trees, removing them one by one, working backward along the trail. The paint came off easily, too easily, peeling away in large flakes as if it wanted to be removed. As Christine removed the blazes, the trail behind her began to fade, literally disappearing, the path becoming forest again. The ghost hikers flickered and vanished with expressions of what might have been relief or gratitude. Christine worked faster, scraping away blaze after blaze, deconstructing the parallel trail, erasing it from existence. The process took hours. But she was motivated by pure survival instinct and the hope that unmaking the trail would free her from it. When Christine removed the final white blaze, the one at the junction where the parallel trail had split from the main trail, reality snapped back like a released rubber band. She found herself standing on the main Appalachian Trail exactly where she should be, with no evidence the parallel trail had ever existed. Her GPS worked normally, showing her precise position. The sun had moved to where it should be based on the actual time. Everything was normal except for Christine's memory and the paint scraper in her hand, still coated with white flakes. Christine reported the incident to the Trail Conservancy, but her story was dismissed as heat exhaustion and dehydration. However, she did convince them to implement a new policy requiring more frequent checks of trail markings and immediate investigation of any unauthorized blazes. Christine has continued her volunteer work, but now she carries extra tools and paint remover, just in case she ever encounters another parallel trail trying to establish itself. She's researched missing hikers more thoroughly and found patterns that disturb her. Many disappearances occur near trail junctions or in areas where unofficial paths branch off from the main trail. Christine believes there are other parallel trails out there, pocket dimensions that capture hikers and hold them in eternal loops. She's made it her mission to find and erase these traps before more people vanish into them. It's become more than volunteer work. It's become a crusade, walking the mountains with scraper in hand, looking for white blazes that shouldn't exist, deconstructing paths that lead nowhere and everywhere simultaneously, freeing the trapped souls one erased blaze at a time. Diane Holloway had been a wilderness guide in the Great Smoky Mountains for 11 years, leading tourists on day hikes and teaching wilderness survival courses. She'd seen black bears, copperheads, and even a mountain lion once, but nothing had ever truly frightened her. The mountains were her home, and she moved through them with the confidence of someone who belonged. In October 2021, that confidence was shattered during what should have been a routine solo camping trip to prepare a new trail route. She'd hiked 8 miles into a remote section of the park, well away from the popular tourist trails, to scout potential locations for an advanced wilderness course. The weather forecast had called for clear conditions, but by late afternoon, a fog rolled in with unnatural speed. One moment she could see for miles across the ridgeline. The next moment she was enveloped in thick gray mist that reduced visibility to less than 15 feet. Diane had experienced mountain fog before, but this was different. It had weight to it, a presence that made her skin crawl. She decided to make camp early rather than risk navigating the unfamiliar terrain in poor visibility. Diane set up her tent in a small clearing, started a fire, and prepared a freeze-dried meal while the fog grew thicker around her. The silence was absolute. No bird calls, no insect sounds, no wind rustling through the trees. Just the crackling of her fire and her own breathing. She told herself it was just the fog dampening sound, but the rational explanation didn't ease the growing tension in her chest. As darkness fell, the fog seemed to glow faintly with its own luminescence. Not quite light, but not quite darkness either. Diane sat by her fire, updating her route notes and trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. Then she heard the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps circling her campsite just beyond the ring of firelight. They didn't sound quite human. The rhythm was wrong, the spacing between steps too long, and there was a wet, sliding quality to each footfall, as if something enormous was dragging itself through the mud. Diane called out, asking if someone needed help, but her voice died in the fog as if the mist itself was absorbing the sound. The footsteps stopped. In the sudden silence, she heard breathing, deep and labored, coming from multiple directions simultaneously. She grabbed her flashlight and swept the beam through the fog. But the light only penetrated a few feet before being swallowed by the gray murk. Shadows moved at the edge of visibility, tall and impossibly thin, swaying slightly as if uncertain of their balance. She retreated to her tent, zipping herself inside and gripping her knife with sweating hands. The footsteps resumed, now accompanied by a sound she couldn't identify at first, something between scraping and whispering. Whatever was out there was circling her tent, making lap after lap around her tiny shelter. Through the tent fabric she could see shadows passing, blocking out the faint glow of the fog. The shadows were wrong. They had too many limbs, and those limbs bent at angles that didn't match any anatomy she knew. Hours passed. The circling never stopped. Diane lay in her sleeping bag, every muscle tensed, listening to the wet footsteps and the scraping, whispering sounds. Then something touched the tent. A hand, or something like a hand, pressed against the fabric from outside, leaving a cold spot that made the material crackle with frost. More hands joined it, dozens of them, pressing against every surface of the tent, surrounding her completely. The tent fabric began to bow inward under the pressure, stretching toward her like a membrane being pushed by hundreds of frozen fingers. Diane screamed and slashed at the tent wall with her knife, cutting her way out the back side. She burst into the fog and ran blindly, abandoning everything except the knife in her hand and the headlamp strapped to her forehead. Behind her, she heard the tent collapse with a sound like breaking ice, followed by a chorus of that scraping, whispering noise, now clearly forming words in a language that hurt her ears to hear. The fog seemed to thicken around her, resisting her movement like cold water. She ran for what felt like hours, crashing through undergrowth, tripping over roots, her lungs burning with effort. Her headlamp created a tiny bubble of light in the endless gray, and in that bubble she began to see them clearly. They stood among the trees, tall figures with too many joints in their limbs, their skin the same gray as the fog, their faces smooth and featureless, except for mouths that opened too wide. They didn't chase her. They just watched, turning their blank faces to follow her progress as she ran past. When the fog finally began to thin as dawn approached, Diane found herself on a paved park road 12 miles from where she'd made camp, though she'd only been running for what felt like an hour. Her clothes were shredded, her arms and legs covered in scratches, but she was alive. Park rangers found her sitting in the middle of the road, shaking and unable to form coherent sentences. They organized a search party to recover her equipment, but they never found her campsite. No tent, no backpack, no fire ring, no evidence she'd ever been there. Diane quit her job as a wilderness guide the following week. She moved to Atlanta, as far from the mountains as she could get while staying in Georgia. She refuses to discuss what happened in detail, but she said one thing repeatedly to the few people who know the story. The fog in the Smokies isn't always just fog. Sometimes it's something else, something that's lived in those mountains since long before humans arrived, and it comes down from the high ridges to hunt. She says she still dreams about those blank faces turning to watch her run, and in the dreams, they're smiling with those two wide mouths, pleased to have discovered such entertaining prey. Sarah Mitchell was a volunteer with the Appalachian Mountain Rescue Team, participating in dozens of successful rescues over her 8 years of service. She was known for her cool head in emergencies and her exceptional navigation skills. In December 2019, Sarah was part of a 4-person team dispatched to find a lost hiker in the Chattahoochee National Forest in Georgia. The hiker, a college student named Michael Peters, had called 911 from somewhere off-trail, reporting that he was injured and couldn't walk, but his phone had died before he could provide specific location details. The rescue team had approximate coordinates from cell tower triangulation and began their search at dawn. Sarah partnered with Tom Garcia, another experienced volunteer, while the other 2 team members searched a parallel grid. They hiked into increasingly rugged terrain, calling Michael's name and listening for responses. After 3 hours of searching, they heard a faint call for help coming from a ravine to the east of their position. Tom and Sarah descended into the ravine, using ropes to navigate the steep slope. At the bottom, they found Michael lying next to a small creek, his ankle clearly broken, his face pale with pain and cold. He'd apparently fallen while trying to take a shortcut and had been unable to climb back out. The rescue seemed straightforward: stabilize the injury, call for extraction support, and carry Michael out on a stretcher. Sarah radioed their position to the other team members and began treating Michael's ankle. That's when things became strange. Sarah's radio crackled, and instead of her team's response, she heard voices speaking in overlapping layers, dozens of conversations happening simultaneously. She couldn't make out specific words, just a cacophony of voices that seemed to be coming from different times and places. Tom reported hearing the same thing on his radio. They exchanged confused looks, then decided to proceed without radio support, marking their route carefully so the other team members could follow their trail markers and find them. As Sarah finished stabilizing Michael's ankle, she noticed something odd about the ravine. The vegetation was wrong for the season and the location. Tropical plants that shouldn't exist in Georgia, mixed with familiar local species. The temperature was warmer at the bottom of the ravine than it had been at the top, though it should have been the opposite. And the light had a strange quality, slightly green-tinted, as if filtering through water rather than air. Tom voiced Sarah's unspoken concerns. "Something's not right here. We should get out quickly." They helped Michael onto the stretcher and began the difficult process of carrying him up the ravine slope. But the slope wasn't where it should be. The ravine walls had changed, becoming steeper and higher, turning what had been a 40-foot descent into what looked like a 100-foot climb. The rope they'd used to descend was still anchored at the top, but now it dangled in empty air, at least 20 feet short of reaching the ground. Sarah and Tom set down the stretcher and assessed their situation. They were trapped in a ravine that had somehow grown taller. Michael was conscious but drifting in and out of lucidity, occasionally muttering about the green place and the voices in the water. Sarah tried her radio again and this time received a clear response, but the voice wasn't from her team. It was her own voice, responding to her own call, having a conversation with herself across some impossible connection. The ravine continued to change around them. New rock formations appeared, pushing up from the ground like time-lapse videos of geological processes. The creek began to flow backward, water climbing uphill against gravity. Plants grew visibly, vines creeping across the rocks in real time, flowers blooming and dying in accelerated cycles. Tom suggested they follow the creek, reasoning that all water flows somewhere. But Sarah recognized that normal rules didn't apply in this place. They tried climbing anyway, leaving Michael temporarily to see if they could reach the top and call for help. The ravine walls resisted their efforts, rock crumbling under their hands, handholds disappearing as they reached for them. After an hour of exhausting attempts, they'd only climbed 15 feet and were no closer to the top. Tom's hands were bleeding from dozens of small cuts, and Sarah's shoulder was badly bruised from a fall. As they returned to Michael, Sarah saw other people in the ravine. At first she thought their team members had found another way in, but these weren't rescuers. They were other lost hikers, other injured people scattered along the ravine floor, some lying still, others sitting and staring blankly. Sarah recognized a few faces from missing persons reports, people who'd vanished in these mountains years ago. They were all here, trapped in this ravine that existed outside normal space. Sarah approached one of them, a woman who disappeared in 2015. The woman didn't respond to questions, didn't acknowledge Sarah's presence at all. She just sat on a rock, staring at the backward-flowing creek, unmoving and unaware. Tom checked several others and reported the same thing. They were alive but not conscious, breathing and blinking but not truly present. Their minds had gone somewhere else, perhaps unable to cope with being trapped in this impossible place. Michael began to deteriorate, his injured ankle somehow getting worse despite the stabilization Sarah had provided. The injury was spreading, bruising climbing up his leg, his skin taking on a gray, stone-like texture. He was being petrified, slowly turning into part of the ravine's geology. Sarah and Tom worked frantically to stop the transformation, but nothing helped. Medical treatment was useless against whatever was happening to Michael. Then Sarah understood. The ravine didn't trap physical bodies. It trapped moments, people, pulling them out of normal time and preserving them forever, the way amber preserves insects. Everyone here had become part of the ravine's collection, frozen in the moment of their greatest need, calling for help that would never arrive, or that had arrived but couldn't leave. The place fed on those preserved moments, growing larger and stranger with each person it collected. Sarah refused to accept this fate. She pulled Tom aside and formed a desperate plan. If the ravine collected people, maybe it would release them if they gave it something better, something it wanted more. Sarah had always carried her grandmother's compass, a family heirloom she'd used on every rescue. It was old, possibly Civil War era, and had guided Sarah through countless successful missions. She'd felt a strange pull from the compass since entering the ravine, as if it recognized this place. Sarah laid the compass on a flat rock in the center of the ravine floor and backed away. The compass needle began spinning wildly, faster and faster, until it became a blur. The green light in the ravine brightened, focusing on the compass, and Sarah felt the pressure of observation, the same sensation of being watched that previous stories had described. The ravine was aware, and it was interested in the compass, an old object with its own history and power. The trade was accepted. The ravine walls began to lower, shrinking back to their original 40-foot height. The rope they'd descended on touched the ground again. The tropical plants withered and disappeared, replaced by normal Georgia forest vegetation. The backward-flowing creek resumed its natural downhill course. Tom and Sarah grabbed Michael's stretcher and climbed frantically, not waiting to see if the changes would reverse. They reached the top and found their team members exactly where they'd started their descent, as if no time had passed. But time had passed. According to the other team members, Sarah and Tom had been gone for 6 days, not 6 hours. A massive search operation had been underway, with hundreds of volunteers combing the forest. Sarah and Tom had simply vanished, along with Michael, and the ravine they descended into couldn't be found by other searchers. Now they were back, exhausted, injured, but alive and with the missing hiker, though Michael remained in his strange, petrified state, his leg gray and stone-like. Michael was hospitalized, and doctors were baffled by his condition. His left leg below the knee had somehow mineralized, becoming actual stone while remaining attached to living tissue. No medical explanation exists for his condition, and he remains in long-term care, his leg a permanent reminder of the time he spent in a ravine that shouldn't exist. Tom quit the rescue team and moved out of state, unable to cope with the memory of those 6 lost days. Sarah continued rescue work for another year, but she was haunted by the faces of the other trapped people she'd seen in the ravine, the missing hikers who were still there, preserved in their moments of need. She'd saved Michael by sacrificing her grandmother's compass, but she'd left the others behind. The guilt became unbearable. She resigned from the rescue team and now works as an advocate for missing persons, compiling databases and patterns, trying to identify which disappearances might involve places like the ravine, locations that exist outside normal reality. She believes there are many such places throughout Appalachia, pockets of impossible geography that trap the unwary. And sometimes, late at night, Sarah swears she can hear her grandmother's compass still spinning somewhere beyond the walls of reality, marking a direction that no one should ever follow, pointing toward places where rescue is impossible because the very concept of leaving has been suspended, and all that remains is an eternal moment of being lost.